This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Japan's LDP is dealt what Prime Minister Ishiba describes as harsh judgment after losing control of the upper house, but vowing to stay on as a leader to tackle rising prices and pursue a U.S. trade deal. Japanese investors tracking the poll outcome despite it being a public holiday. The yen staying firm while Nikkei futures rise. Meantime, weather woes across the region. A severe tropical storm lashing southern China after sweeping across Taiwan, the Philippines and Hong Kong. Some relief, though, in South Korea. Rains have eased after deadly storms left 18 dead and forced the evacuation of thousands. Ahead on East Asia tonight, South Korea's new leader has pledged to make his country a safer place to prevent any repeat of the recent disasters that critics have slammed for being completely preventable. Among his promises, a new investigation into a deadly crowd crush in 2022. We look at whether he can do this and why now. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has vowed to stay on as the country's leader following his coalition's stinging loss at Sunday's key poll. Now, the Liberal Democratic Party and the Komeito Party alliance lost its majority in the legislature's upper house election yesterday. Now, Mr. Ishiba called the result a harsh judgment on his government. He apologized to the LDP and pledged to continue governing for the sake of political stability.
いつまでという期限を今考えておるわけではございません。先ほど申し上げましたように、アメリカの関税措置、あるいは物価高への対応、明日起こるかもしれない自然災害への対応、そして戦後最も複雑で厳しい安全保障環境、このような喫緊の課題について解決の道筋をつけると、全力で対応すると、そのことを申し上げておるところでございます。
The governing alliance secured 47 seats, just 3 shy of the 50 needed to retain its majority. The LDP Komeito coalition already has 75 seats in the 248-member chamber not being contested this election. It needed a total of 125 to maintain control. Now, the main opposition Constitutional Democratic Party finished second with 22 seats, while the fringe far-right Saiseito Party won 14 seats, making strong gains from the one spot it previously held. The LDP had already lost control of the more important lower house of representatives last October. So this means the party now leads a coalition without controlling either house for the first time in 70 years. All right, for more on this, we are joined now by CNA's Michio Ishida live from Tokyo. So, Mitch, the Prime Minister has vowed to stay on, so what's next for him?
Well, it's actually surprising that he's not stepping down because usually it's the practice. The LDP president lost a number of seats, losing a majority. And naturally, and traditionally, they have been stepping down. But he said that he should not let national politics come to a standstill. And there are many challenges Japan is facing, and he has to address them. This includes higher cost of living, disaster mitigation, security in the region. As the environment surrounding Japan, the tension is at its highest since the end of World War II. And he stressed the importance of dealing with U.S. tariffs. But as I mentioned, traditionally, prime ministers have stepped down after losing major elections. Shinzo Abe did in 2007, and Mr. Taro Aso did in 2009. Mr. Ishiba lost 3 major elections in just 10 months since taking office in October last year. In baseball, you would say it's 3 strikes, you're out. So analysts think he will be under pressure to give up his post. Mr. Ishiba's term as LDP president ends in September 2027. LDP's charter stipulates with a majority support from LDP lawmakers and heads of local chapters, an early party presidential election can take place, which can boot him out of power. And if action is taken for a party election, a political insider said it can take place as early as in the second week of August.
With Mr. Ishiba just hanging by a thread there, how do you think all this political uncertainty, how is that going to affect tariff negotiations?
Well, Mr. Ishiba has actually sent his U.S. tariffs negotiator, Economic Revitalization Minister Ryosei Akazawa, to Washington for the 8th time today. And it's reported Mr. Akazawa will attempt a meeting with U.S. Treasury Secretary Howard Lutnick and Treasury's Secretary Scott Bessent. And Mr. Ishiba said at his news conference, he himself aims to directly hold dialogue with Mr. Donald Trump. And his stance is Japan is the biggest foreign investor in the U.S., creating more jobs than any other country. And he wants tariffs removed from Japanese cars, which made up 28% of Japan's exports to the U.S. in 2024. He understands the U.S. has its say, but he wants to find common ground for the national interests of both the U.S. and Japan. Now, Japanese media say if negotiation with the U.S. proceed in a positive direction for Japan, Mr. Ishiba could stay in office. But if it's the other way around, it could give his party an additional reason to take him down.
Quite a lot at stake for the Prime Minister. Well, thanks very much for that. CNA's Michio Ishida live from Tokyo, where we're going to keep this conversation going. Let's now bring in Tomohiko Taniguchi, Special Advisor at the Fujitsu Future Studies Center and Specially Appointed Professor at the University of Tsukuba. Well, welcome yet again, Professor. So, Japan's ruling coalition, they've now lost control of both houses of parliament, which is a big deal. It's the first since 1955. How much can Prime Minister Ishiba realistically get done now at this point?
He is trying to make a new narrative that he is to brave it out. But to brazen it out may be an appropriate term. I think the voters have lost confidence in him, and he has clearly received a vote of non-confidence from the general public, as was said by Mitch Ishida, that he has been a huge loser, losing 3 major elections in a row. And seldom have we seen such a political leader who has lost quite a few elections in a row and then wishes to stick to the position that he is in now. So the answer to your question is that he is going to find a tall barrier going forward to make whatever policies implementable.
So, Michio as well said that, some of the critics are saying that that direction could possibly change if, U.S. trade deals or negotiations go well for Prime Minister Ishiba. I mean, do you see it possibly going that way?
I am not sure, to be honest, but if you look at the noticeable tendency that Donald J. Trump has shown, he likes someone with big political capital, big stomach, and big power to determine himself. Those are the traits that you cannot find at the moment in Ishiba.
Now, Ishiba, though, he did say that the coalition's poor showing was because, his government's measures to combat all these price increases have yet to reach many people. Your thoughts on that?
Prime Minister Ishiba himself has wavered as to how he should deliver a policy to compensate the loss of revenues caused by inflation. And he sometimes said that he would not decrease Japanese value-added tax, that is to say consumption tax. But at one point, he went on to say that tax reduction may be necessary. So on that point, he has zigged and zagged as regards Japanese economic policy. So it's hard to say, really. And the good news for him, perhaps, is that the legislative chamber is not going to open for some time. It's going to open only at the end of September or the early part of October. Then they're going to discuss seriously what sort of things should be done. So it's all talk at the moment.
Right, still got a few more months there. Now, you were close to Shinzo Abe, being his special advisor to his cabinet. How do you think Mr. Abe would have handled this differently, given in this particular time when we're talking about rising public anger over the prices and also growing anti-foreign sentiment?
It is not the fault of Ishiba, but the previous Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, effectively purged. I cannot delve into the technicality and the details of that story, but Mr. Kishida effectively purged those members who were loyal and faithful to Abe. So the conservative wing of this broad church named LDP has been split into two, socially conservative and socially progressive. And socially conservative people seems to have lost their faith in the LDP and have chosen to go other directions. And the new party, the Saiseito, literally translated into Party for Political Participation, has offered a sort of place that they can cast their ballots on. So the departure of Abe himself has caused a chain reactions of this sort. Sometimes someone has to stop this chain reaction, but Kishida, Ishiba only accelerated the unraveling of the party.
Yeah, so, Saiseito's party's rise is pretty dramatic, right? 14 seats from a fringe party known for all their conspiracy theories and all that. So what does that tell us about in terms of where Japanese politics is heading?
It tells you that if you look at who have actually given support to Saiseito, the Party for Political Participation, if you look at the age distribution, the younger generations have been supportive of that new party. So there's been a great amount of frustrations you can see within those age brackets. And they may be frustrated by many things, but one of the things is this great fault line between the aged citizens, senior citizens, and the younger generations. And social contract must be rewritten in order for the social welfare program to become friendlier to the younger generations. So that takes a lot of political capital, and the Japanese public do understand that in order for this sort of grave task to be tackled, the Ishiba cannot do that. And then who can? So that who can is a pending great question that awaits answers.
Right. So in the meantime, what's going to be happening to the LDP? I mean, do you foresee some kind of a conflict there, among its members?
The scent of blood is in the air for sure. 13 members have been ousted, have lost their jobs, and each one of those members does have, for instance, 20, 30 employees, secretaries, and drivers, and so on and so forth. So you're basically talking about hundreds of people who are going to have to be dependent on, unemployment benefits. So this general, if you like, Prime Minister Ishiba, has lost a war, and he's not taking responsibilities. So naturally, he's going to face very much fierce antagonistic feelings from within the party. As you say, your true opponent, your true enemy is on your back.
Thanks very much for that conversation and chat. Tomohiko Taniguchi, Special Advisor at the Fujitsu Future Studies Center and Specially Appointed Professor at the University of Tsukuba. Now, we do have more analysis of Japan's election results on our website, so do head to cna.asia, and you may also track the latest via our mobile app. As Japan's ruling coalition reflects on its election loss, the country's top trade negotiator has made clear that tariff talks will not be impacted, with more discussions set to be held in the U.S. this week. Hirohise Akazawa is preparing for an 8th round of negotiations in Washington, though the schedule is still being finalized. He said that Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba had instructed him to vigorously continue the talks. Mr. Akazawa earlier told reporters that protecting Japan's national interest remains the top priority. Tokyo is hoping to clinch a deal ahead of the 1st August deadline that will help it avert an American tariff of 25% on imports from Japan. The levy's impact on Japan's automobile sector stands out as especially severe, threatening not only major automakers, but also the vast network of small suppliers, manufacturers that support the industry. Well, the auto sector is critical to Japan's economy, with roughly 8% of jobs tied to it. Just last month, Japan's auto exports to the U.S. plunged more than 25% on year. And also headed to Washington for tariff discussions is South Korea's National Security Advisor, Wee Sung-lak. Media reports are saying that other officials, including new Industry Minister Kim Jung-kwon, could also be traveling to the U.S. this week. Mr. Kim said on Monday that tariff talks with the U.S. are in a critical phase. Oh, going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, China's smaller and less wealthy cities see a steeper decline in consumer demand for property. Plus, some Chinese EV makers fudge books to inflate sales to hit aggressive targets. Hello again. You are watching East Asia tonight, and it is now time for business news with Roland. So, Roland, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is vowed to stay on. How are investors dealing with that?
Well, the Japanese equity markets closed for a public holiday, but Japan's currency and Nikkei's futures strengthening as Japan's Prime Minister has vowed to stay in power even after the election defeat. Strategists say investors had already priced in the election outcome. The Japanese yen had dropped for 2 weeks ahead of the vote on concern of a poor showing by the Prime Minister, which would open the door for more spending and tax cuts. Some economists say investors had positioned for a larger setback for the coalition and even anticipated Ishiba's resignation. The relief that has been a political risk has been averted, and that is boosting the yen. The removal of Japan's consumption tax was a key election issue as households struggled to cope with rising prices. Mr. Ishiba stood firm against tax cuts, but his loss opens the door to opposition parties calling for reduced taxes and increased spending. And that could lead to increased borrowing, which takes us to the volatility in Japan's debt markets. Japanese government bond yields have been surging across the curve in the run-up to the upper house election. The main concern was tax cuts will force Japan to increasingly rely on public debt, pushing bond buyers to demand higher risk premiums to shoulder the country's fiscal troubles. Francis Tan of Indosuez Wealth Management says that Japan's economic fundamentals remains robust despite the political uncertainty.
Well, Japan, the economy is growing quite well, especially after 2-3 decades of the lost decades, we call them. Right now, in fact, if you look at the latest Japanese CPI numbers, there's some inflation still going on. Although the headline inflation was trending a bit lower, but the whole inflation is moving higher. I was even looking at things such as your tourism arrivals, even tourism arrivals from China. That's already hitting levels pre-COVID. So expenditure in Japan from foreign visitors are strong. The only thing right now is over the last couple of weeks is the big uncertainty politically, and that certainly saw the yen trending a little bit lower. Now a little bit holding there because some form of certainty is coming in. And like all asset classes, investors, when they are very fearful, things start to trend lower until now when there's more certainty. Going forward, I still believe that at the end of the day, the bond yields in Japan will still have to trend higher because the economic fundamentals are still quite robust for the whole of Japan.
South Korea's trade being impacted by weaker shipments to the U.S. and China amid persistent uncertainties over President Trump's tariff policies. For the first 20 days of this month, outbound shipments slid 2.2% on year, while imports dropped more than 4%. Now, South Korea is a major producer of electronics, ships, and cars. It is facing severe economic disruption if it can't reach a trade deal with the Trump administration by the August deadline. The country generates more than 40% of its GDP from exports. Its trade figures also a bellwether for developed economies, being one of the first countries to report them. Land sales across China's smaller and less wealthy cities dropping to their lowest level in almost 10 years, another sign of the nation's deepening housing crisis. Data from financial information provider Wind shows that in the first half of the year, all land transactions in third-tier mainland cities generated a revenue of $50 billion. Now, that's 4% lower than the same period last year and comes despite a slight rise in sales of residential units. Though sales in the first and second tier cities rose 8% for the period, they still remain the fourth lowest recorded by Wind. At the same time, the first tier cities saw sales rising 30% on year by value alone. The real estate bust has depressed household spending in the world's second biggest economy and exacerbated budget strains for local economies, or authorities, I should say, which depend on land revenue for a large chunk of their income. Beijing has unveiled a flurry of measures in the past 4 years to rescue the property market, including easing mortgage rules and providing tens of billions of dollars for local governments to buy unsold homes. But experts suggest the focus has been more on first-tier cities, while the smaller ones have been largely left out. And Greater China markets closing at a near 3.5-year high, led by rare earth and construction sectors. Investors also hoping for fresh economic stimulus measures at the upcoming Politburo meeting. The Shanghai Composite ending today 0.7% higher, Shenzhen slightly more, up by 0.9 nearly. Hong Kong stocks rose as internet heavyweights rallied following a government rebuke on price wars. Meituan, JD.com and Alibaba all rising more than 2% for the day. In the currency space, some volatility in the Chinese yuan against the greenback. Now, traders remain cautious following the latest comment on the tariff deadline by the White House. Interest rate concerns partly adding to the pressure on the yuan as well. Now, China's long-dated Treasury futures also dropped to their lowest level in 5 weeks, while bond yields broadly rose across all tenures. China's commercial banks have kept prime lending rates unchanged as widely expected at this month's fixing. The one-year loan prime rate, or LPR, capped at 3%, while the 5-year LPR was unchanged, 3.5%. Most new and outstanding loans in China based on the one-year LPR, while the 5-year rate influences the pricing of mortgages. Now, this move comes after China's economy grew at a slightly faster than expected pace in the second quarter. GDP expanded at 5.2% in the April to June quarter from a year earlier, showing resilience in the face of U.S. tariffs. China has hit back against EU sanctions on a number of Chinese banks and companies, saying that the bloc's actions harmed economic and financial ties. China's Commerce Ministry adds that Beijing will take, quote, necessary measures to protect the rights of its companies. Last week, the EU added 2 Chinese banks based in the northeastern province of Heilongjiang, which borders Russia, in its sanctions list for allegedly providing cryptocurrency services for Russia, circumventing existing EU restrictions against Moscow. Now, 7 Chinese companies were added to the list, including 4 with offices in Hong Kong. China's auto industry has been shaken by accusations of inflated sales by 2 of its leading car makers, Zeekr and Neta. Now, both are said to have used an insurance scheme to manipulate sales numbers to hit aggressive targets. The 2 firms insured cars before they were sold to buyers, passing them off as sold without handing over the keys. An investigation by Reuters showed that Neta used this scheme on more than 60,000 EVs between January of 2023 and March of 2024. Now, Zeekr also used the same method to book early sales in late last year. Its unusually high sales in the cities of Shenzhen and Xiamen in December are under scrutiny. China's EV industry is in the throes of intense competition, driven by overcapacity and a desire to capture market share. That's led to declining prices and put a squeeze on profit margins. In May, BYD offered discounts of up to 34% on some of its models, sparking condemnation from state media. The world's largest EV maker has ambitious sales targets for this year, but doubts are growing that it'll be able to meet its target of 5.5 million units. Now, under this target, BYD has to sell some 560,000 cars per month. Now, for reference, the company's highest monthly sales was just under 515,000 last December. And that's the latest in business. Oteli.
Thanks so much for that, Roland. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, South Korea has been slammed for its poor handling of major disasters. And now its new president wants a new investigation into a deadly Halloween stampede back in 2022. And we'll be asking an expert why now and what a new team can achieve. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we've been following. At least 18 people have died after torrential rain and landslides in South Korea. The president orders flood-hit areas to be designated special disaster zones to bolster rescue and recovery. China also lashed by heavy rains. Storm Wipha leaving a trail of destruction in Guangdong province after making landfall on Sunday. Heavy rain is forecast to continue across the Guangxi, Hainan, and Fujian. And Japan's Prime Minister holding on to power after a stinging loss on the weekend. Mr. Ishiba has called the election a harsh judgment on his government. Japan's fringe right-wing Saiseito Party has emerged as one of the upper house election's biggest winners. It's projected to take about 14 seats, much higher than the two it held going into the poll. Saiseito broke into mainstream Japanese politics at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. It was actually born on YouTube, noted for spreading conspiracy theories about vaccinations and the so-called globalist elites. 2 years later, party leader Sohei Kamiya won Saiseito's first seat in the upper house. Now, his Japanese First campaign was patterned after Donald Trump's nationalist and anti-immigration rhetoric. The movement resonated with younger voters frustrated with Japan's growing population of foreign residents. Foreigners living in Japan hit a record 3.8 million last year as companies turned to foreign workers amid a deepening labor shortage and an aging society. Although immigration issues were among top voter concerns that drove Sunday's election, along with the declining birth rate and rising cost of living, and Saiseito's pledges of tax cuts and welfare spending, and a warning against what it called a silent invasion of immigrants appear to have struck a chord with voters. Japanese citizens said that they were not surprised by the outcome of the upper house election. They cited issues like rising prices, saying that the LDP-Komeito alliance could have done better to address the concerns of voters.
うまく税金を取ってもらうことが一番いいと思いますね。やっぱり稼いでる人間から取って、で稼げない人間からはもう少し、苦しい生活させないような形がいいと思います。
政権与党にとっては絶好のチャンスだったと思うんですよ。トランプさんの暴走であったり、米の価格が上がったりなんだり、一つでも解決してればね、パッと上がったチャンスだったのに、なんか我々には何の実感もなくてね、このままアメリカに押し切られるのかなとか。
Now, the upper house election was also the focus of today's special episode of the CNA Correspondent podcast. Teresa Tang connected with Michio Ishida to discuss what lies ahead for the embattled Japanese Prime Minister. Well, of course, you can catch the rest of that episode and other behind-the-scenes conversations with our global team of reporters on our podcast, CNA Correspondent. It's available on our website, CNA, or Me Listen apps, as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. The South Korean President Myung has ordered the setting up of a new investigation team to look into a deadly crowd crush that killed 159 mostly young people 3 years ago. Mr. Yi's announcement came after his meeting last week with the families of victims of recent disasters, including the Halloween crush that took place nearly 3 years ago in Seoul's Itaewon district. The president bowed deeply as he apologized for any failures by the authorities. Now, he has also vowed to make the country safer and to prevent any repeat of the tragedies. Now, for more on this, let's bring in Sean King, Senior Vice President at the New York-based business advisory firm Park Strategies and also a specialist in East Asian affairs. Well, Sean, thanks for joining us this evening. Of course, early morning at your end in New York. So it's been 3 years since the Itaewon tragedy. Let's talk about the timing of this fresh investigation. I guess the big question is, why now?
There's been a simmering sense, particularly on the political left in South Korea, that there's never been a full accounting for this tragedy. There have been only a few convictions and very few harsh sentences meted out. And a special commission was set up to look into it in September 2024. And the allegation is that the then Yoon Suk-yeol administration, who's since been ousted from office after his botched martial law declaration in December of last year, did not fully cooperate with that commission, not sharing police records and also not letting investigators know of the government's response. Also, at the time of the tragedy, President Yoon's response was considered lacking by many, somewhat aloof and not that sensitive. And in subsequent years, he had ordered government officials, for example, not to refer to it as a disaster, but as an accident, and to stop calling the victims and just refer to them as the dead. So this has been a long time coming, and I think part of a larger look back into the Yoon years by the new government.
So, I mean, that's right. I mean, we've heard from the bereaved family saying that key records, data, all of that was withheld from the commission. So in a nutshell, who is responsible for that? And with this new investigation, how is that going to shake up investigations?
You know, I really don't know. That's what this investigation is going to help. It's not just an investigation of the tragedy itself, but it seems to be like an investigation of the original investigation. And from it, you hope you get some closure for the families, learn some lessons that this never happens again. I hope it just doesn't become a political cudgel for one side to use against the other. Specifically, that night in Itaewon, and it's a very crowded, densely packed neighborhood, you had 100,000 revelers, but only 137 police officers on duty. Meanwhile, that same day, hundreds, if not thousands, were deployed to monitor anti-Yoon protests and to protect Yoon's office, which had been recently relocated nearby. So there's also a suspicion that Yoon had prioritized too many police resources for himself at the expense of these young people who tragically died that night.
Well, we know that the former head of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency, he was acquitted, citing that there's lack of evidence of professional negligence. So do you think with this new investigation, it could possibly lead to prosecutions of senior officials?
Absolutely. It could. Again, I haven't seen the evidence. Maybe that's part of the problem. Nobody has. But with this new government and this new agenda and a fresh look, and some, looking for justice, there certainly could be some very serious convictions and sentences coming up.
Right. Now, some critics have said that, perhaps President Lee is also using this moment to boost his credibility as a new leader. I mean, aside from obviously, trying to help, provide closure for bereaved families, do you think there's any political calculus behind President Lee's move?
Sure, but that's what leaders do. That doesn't mean it's wrong. All leaders look to make themselves look as good as possible. Just sometimes that happens to coincide with what's good for the public, and this may be one of those cases. Going back to South Korea's long track record of unfortunate incidents, I think he wants to draw a line into the past and move forward. So yeah, there is politics involved, but I'm not yet going to fault him for that, because this is something that obviously needs to be looked at on its own account.
Right. And aside from looking into this, South Korea has had, unfortunately, a string of national tragedies that's blamed on poor disaster response. We've got the Sewol ferry on top of the Itaewon incident. These lapses that keep repeating, I mean, do you think Lee Jae-myung is also trying to tighten things up?
Yeah, but we shouldn't jump to too many conclusions. I mean, Itaewon was so unique. It was not infrastructure per se. This part of town used to be notorious when the nearby U.S. base was there as a den of prostitution and vice, and then later on for illegally copied goods. I remember when I first went there in 1997 during the IMF crisis in grad school, you could go to shops where all the counterfeit goods were organized by brand with labels. It's only recently that Itaewon has become a trendy people where even local Seoulites want to go. And it's very, very compact and tight, narrow streets. So this is sort of a unique situation. But going back to really the worst of all was in 1995, the Sampu department store mall in Seoul collapsed, killing 502 people. And that was a classic case of over-construction without proper safety being taken, a lot of bribes paid to local officials to look the other way. And then also the Sewol ferry incident, where the ship was overloaded and ballast water was too little just to make more profit for the company. And then again, Park Geun-hye, the president at the time, seemed a little aloof and distant in her response. So there are, I think, in some cases, too much emphasis on profit, not enough emphasis on safety. And also there have been a string of dastardly fires over the years where a lot of restaurants and bars overcrowd and they tend to use insulation that's cheaper but more flammable. So I think there needs to be more priority of safety, less priority on profit. Every country is guilty of that. It just happens a lot in Korea. You have very active media looking at this and a highly developing economy. But hopefully these things happen less and less as we move forward.
Yeah, so picking up that point you made about, a lot of these firms talk about, wanting to make profit and perhaps safety is not exactly a priority on its list. But, let's go back to the fact that Halloween is about, 3 months away. Have you seen some sort of concrete reforms or beyond just apologies and probes that you've actually seen South Korean government doing to prevent another crowd crush?
Yes. Again, that particular Halloween was a unique case because it was the first major public event for youth and partiers after pandemic restrictions have been lifted. So that was a unique case. In the next year, 2023, hundreds of officers were deployed, a lot more cameras been set up, and people were discouraged from going into narrow alleys. And there has not been anything like that since. So in that specific neighborhood on Halloween itself, I have seen a lot more concrete measures taken to make sure this doesn't happen again. And since then, there have been many successful, we just went through another major political election in Korea and also all those demonstrations about Yoon's martial law, and there was no safety. And big concerts. I'll be seeing Oasis at Goyeong Stadium in Seoul on October 21st, and I feel very safe going there. So it seems like lessons already have been learned, and hopefully more will be as a result of this investigation.
Hey, thanks so very much for sharing, especially with your personal experiences in Seoul. Sean King there, Senior Vice President at the New York-based business advisory firm Park Strategies. On that note, let's go for a short break now. But coming up next on East Asia tonight, Storm Wipha leaves a trail of destruction along the coastal regions of southern China and Vietnam. In its path, hunkers down ahead of its arrival. 18 killed and 9 unaccounted for in South Korea, days after heavy rains and landslides struck parts of the country. A report says that China's influence over Southeast Asia's development is set to expand as Western donors cut back on development aid. A report by Australian think tank Lowy Institute estimates a drop in $2 billion in development finance to the region by 2026, hitting the region hard. It says poorer countries such as Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar are likely to lose out the most from the reductions. China's development finance to Southeast Asia reached nearly $5 billion in 2023, and they consist mostly of major infrastructure projects such as rail links in Indonesia and Malaysia. The report adds that as trade ties with the U.S. weaken amid the tariff war, development options for regional countries could shrink, leaving them in a weaker position to negotiate better terms with China. It also notes that other Asian donors, such as Japan and South Korea, stand to gain in importance. In the meantime, U.S. President Donald Trump has halted about $60 billion in development assistance so far, and 7 European countries, including France and Germany, have also announced cuts of more than $17 billion for the next 4 years. China has begun building the world's largest dam on the Tibetan plateau. The area is a top biodiversity hotspot and also home to a nature reserve. The $167 billion project consists of 5 hydropower stations along the Yalong-Zangbor River. A section of that river offers huge hydropower potential as it falls some 2 kilometers in a span of just 50 kilometers. Well, the dams are estimated to produce 300 billion kilowatt hours of electricity a year when complete. That is enough to power Beijing for more than 2 straight years. Officials say it will play a major role in China's carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals, and also boost the country's construction, cement and steel industries. Chinese Premier Li Qiang, who officiated the project ceremony over the weekend, described it as a project of the century and that efforts must be placed on ecological conservation to prevent environmental damage. China has stressed the project will not severely impact downstream water supplies, but India and Bangladesh have raised concerns. Well, that's because the Yalong-Zangbor River runs through northeastern India, through the states of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, before flowing into Bangladesh. Well, the project is expected to provide a significant economic boost, driving demand for construction and building materials. The prospect pushing the CSI Construction and Engineering Index up more than 4%. Shares in Power Construction Corp rallied more than 10%, and tunnel equipment maker Hunan Wusin ending the day nearly 30% higher. Meanwhile, yields of long-term Chinese government bonds rose as demand for them dropped. And remember, the price of bonds are inverse to their yields. The lower their price, the higher their yields. It comes as investors see the multi-billion-dollar mega-infrastructure project as part of the central government's support to the economy by boosting demand, by taking on more debt to increase spending. A severe tropical storm Wipha has left a trail of destruction across parts of coastal southern China, with heavy rain and strong winds still felt in the region. Cleanup efforts, meantime, are underway in Hong Kong after the city raised its highest typhoon warning signal over the weekend. The city is gradually resuming services as the storm moves away. Airport authorities worked overnight to clear the backlog of 500 cancelled flights, dispatching passengers who had been stranded for more than 12 hours. Now, as Wipha continued on its course, the storm made landfall near Taishan City in Guangdong province, prompting more than 270,000 people to be relocated. Evacuees were provided with daily necessities, including instant noodles, snacks and bottled water. The storm is forecast to make a second landfall in Vietnam early tomorrow, bringing heavy rainfall that could cause flash floods and landslides. The storm will likely complicate search and rescue efforts in Ha Long Bay, where a tourist boat had capsized, killing dozens of tourists. South Korean President Lee Myung has called for flood-stricken regions to be designated special disaster zones to bolster rescue and recovery efforts. Days of torrential rain have triggered floods and landslides, killing at least 18 people. Also, houses were covered in mud and trees toppled in the South Korean resort town of Gapyeong County after torrential rain triggered a landslide on Sunday. Flooding from a swollen river had caused buildings to collapse. 2 people have died and 4 others still missing in the county.
밑으로 쑥 가라앉은 거 근데 물이 여기까지 차더라고요, 여기까지. 근데 마침 저런 이런 새 파이프가 있었어. 새 파이프를 있는 실컷 내가 붙잡고 있던 거지, 있는 실컷. 내가 여기서 10년 장사했거든요. 이게 뭐냐고 10년 동안. 냉장고님, 냉장고가 몇 대고 그런데 맞아. 이게 뭐냐고 집도 여기다.
More than 14,000 people have been evacuated and thousands of properties damaged. Some 41,000 households lost power temporarily. Local media say the rain has largely subsided in the worst-hit areas now, but weather authorities warn of an incoming heat wave, predicting that temperatures of up to 35 degrees Celsius. South Korea says it's reviewing plans to improve relations with North Korea after a news report that said Seoul is considering allowing individual tours to the north. South Korea's Unification Ministry says it's looking at policies that will ease tensions in the Korean peninsula and that individual tours are not in violation of international sanctions. Trips to the north have been suspended since 2008, if you recall, after a South Korean tourist was shot dead by North Korean soldiers when visiting Mount Kumgang Resort in the north. Pyongyang claims that the tourist had entered an off-limits military area. North Korea recently opened a beach resort in Wonsan. It's a flagship project to promote tourism, though only domestic tourists are allowed to visit for now. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has arrived in Washington ahead of talks with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. Defense and security issues are expected to top the agenda, especially clashes in the South China Sea. The two allies have been boosting their defense engagements, including joint military exercises in recent months, to deter what they see as China's aggression in the region. Mr. Marcos will also meet U.S. Defense Chief Pete Hegseth and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Mr. Trump's tariff threats, though, likely to cast a shadow over this meeting. The Philippines faces a 20% levy on exports to the U.S. starting August 1st, unless a new deal is reached. U.S. President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping could meet in a few months as both sides seek to de-escalate trade tensions. SCMP, citing multiple sources, says that talks could be held either on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea or in China before the event. Mr. Xi is reportedly planning to participate. The U.S. leader has yet to confirm his attendance. Experts cited by the report say that Mr. Trump may visit Shanghai or another Chinese city instead of the capital, to distinguish from his 2017 Beijing visit. Earlier this month, top diplomats from both sides held high-level talks. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi on the sidelines of an ASEAN gathering in Malaysia as part of efforts to stabilize relations. Now, this meeting was seen as a positive sign towards cooperation. Mr. Rubio had also said then there was a, quote, high probability that the two leaders will meet this year. LC relations have been strained since the Trump administration announced its so-called reciprocal tariffs. China was hit with some of the highest rates, prompting officials to threaten retaliation. Tensions, though, have eased after both sides agreed to a preliminary trade deal and to continue negotiations. China has confirmed top leaders from the European Union will visit Beijing later this week. The presidents of the European Council and European Commission, Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen, will meet Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang at the 25th China-EU summit. Both sides are seeking to smooth over a series of trade disputes. The EU has demanded that China ease market access for European companies and loosen export controls on rare earth minerals. Beijing responded by urging the bloc to establish a more objective and rational understanding of the country. The summit takes place against the backdrop of rising trade tensions and higher tariffs by U.S. President Donald Trump. Washington's close allies, including those in Europe, are trying to develop alternative trade links that skirt the U.S. market. EU and China together account for almost 30% of global trade and more than a third of global GDP. And that's a wrap of East Asia Tonight this Monday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And of course, you can find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.